Hi, everybody. Welcome to Global Technology Facilitated Gender-Based Violence, our webinar on feminist AI solutions. This is being given by the FAIR, the Feminist AI Research Network, our global hubs, and it features 3 different regions that we work with. There's Asia, led by Suraj Hangladaram and Supavati Aramwith at Chulalongkorn University. The MENA Hub, led by Nagla Risk at the American University Cairo, and the LAC Hub, led by Paula Ricarte at Tecnológico de Monterrey. And I'm Caitlin Kraft-Buckman. I'm at Women at the Table, and I'm one of the leaders of the A+ Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms, of which FAIR is a beloved daughter. This is the last webinar that we have featuring our work that we've been doing with FAIR through our Incubating Feminist AI initiative. And so we've had webinars that began in August on feminist AI frameworks featuring the extraordinary Jamila Venturini of Derechos Digitales, also in conversation with Paula Ricarte about a new framework to look at about how we can construct feminist AI, then going through into September on our theme for this quarter on technology-facilitated gender-based violence, featuring a pilot run Amor AI, which measures gender-based violence in Latin America in order to understand the patterns leading to femininicide, working with criminal courts in Buenos Aires. Also a prototype Sophia on technology-facilitated gender-based violence Reportabot for women's access to reporting mechanisms from Chile, and Safer on AI-empowered mobility of women, reclaiming women's mobility in urban transit from the Philippines. Then we moved on in October to more prototypes that we had all built together with IDEA, which works on democratizing technical barriers for bias in NLP in order to look at LLMs, word embeddings. From Argentina, La Independiente's gender and AI crowd work to help LAC gig workers connect and improve and to organize online in Mexico. And our last webinar, our penultimate webinar this quarter, which featured papers from our last cohort on new thinkings and new systems in feminist AI. So we had presentations of papers on child marriage in Indonesia and turning the tide on it through community engagement. Our wonderful friends from Point of View, who you'll hear from again on reimagining. I have a lot of extra ings today. Automated violence interventions, explainable AI tutoring from Upper Egypt to sort of help change allocation resources in community schools, indigenous rights and water conservations with the participation of the Yaqui community from Mexico, and analyzing public procurement in Guatemala, in Ecuador with a gender perspective, and finally feminist NLP, looking at creating a corpus of worker-based injuries for the first time, disaggregating by sex. So that's an awful lot. I can barely get it all out. It's all on our website. We have the webinars, we have the papers, we have the prototypes. When we built prototypes, there's the code. We're really trying to understand, to co-create, to collaborate, to debate, and figure where we can make what is feminist AI, what is pro-social, where we can actually really help and create positive solutions and muscular environments where we really are in control of the technology that we need for this next century. So we now have our ultimate webinar of 2023 on this theme of technology-facilitated gender-based violence with an incredible lineup. We have Antonia Eser-Ruperti from UNESCO. We have Stephanie Mikkelson from UNFPA. We have Shohini Banerjee from Point of View, and then later her colleague Padmini Ray Murray from Design Beku on their project. We have Raya Sharbain from the Tor project and Paloma Lara Castro from Derechos Digitales. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up our first landscaper, who's Antonia Eser-Ruperti, who is, as I've just said, is from UNESCO, is an associate program officer at the Section for Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists, where she focuses on the organization's project to support journalists and media resilience in Afghanistan, Ukraine, and other crisis contexts. And prior to UNESCO, she was program officer for Eastern Europe, and with a focus on civil society projects in those same Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and Turkey. So over to you, Antonia.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen and then we can get started. 1 second. Okay, I hope this is working for all of you now.
Not quite yet.
Okay, let me double check. 1 second.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Apologies for that. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. As Caitlin kindly introduced, I work with UNESCO in our section for freedom of expression, but I've also worked on our 3 pieces of research I will be briefly presenting that UNESCO has done into gender-based and technology-facilitated violence. And I know we're speaking in a round of amongst experts, so most of this will not be new, but it's still shocking nonetheless. I wanted to start with 2 statistics. One is a survey done by Plan International in 2020 that found that 58% of young women and girls have experienced online harassment on social media. And we know that this escalates when we look at women that are in positions of power or in positions of influence. That is true for women journalists as much as it's true for female parliamentarians. And also in 2020, we did a research called The Chilling, which some of you may know. And there we see this kind of very black and white, that 73% of women journalists that we surveyed had experienced online violence. And I think one of the things we always say is that it also shows that violence doesn't stay online. 20% of those have said that offline threats that they experienced, but also actual offline attacks were related to the violence that they experienced online. We also saw that this is intersectional and that it escalates further for members of the LGBTQI community, women of color. And I think it's important to note that both of these statistics, so the 73% and the 58% I just mentioned, are based on research that was done before generative AI took off in the way that we see it now. So it's very likely that these statistics are going to rise. And I will move on because we've just 3 weeks ago published an issue brief that was authored by Ruman Chowdhury, who many of you may know as an expert in the field that looked at technology-facilitated gender-based violence through generative AI. And the slide that you see here are basically let's focus on the first 5 bars. This was a research by UN Women, also from 2020, on the areas of online violence that women mostly experience. And I'm putting this on here, so misinformation, cyber harassment, hate speech, impersonation, to show how with generative AI, there's a risk that all of this escalates because it's what we call the 4 V's of generative AI. So one is that the sheer volume of disinformation that we see can escalate through generative AI, which makes it even more difficult to address the sheer amount of online attacks that we are seeing. The variety increases. So we have image-based abuse, which tends to disproportionately affect women. We have more and more sophisticated voice cloning, and this also makes it more difficult to detect. And then the velocity, so the sheer spread of the information on platforms, when it's automated, when it's emails, text messages, etc., that are automatized. And then finally, the veracity. So the fact that with generative AI, these images become more and more real, deep fakes become more sophisticated, it becomes more difficult to detect them. So this is maybe a brief summary of how we are looking at this issue. And in her issue brief, Roman Chowdhury puts forward a number of recommendations. And I also want to stress that I think one of the biggest issues that we see is now a lot of approaches to dealing with this put the onus on women to deal with it, to force them out of the public space, to silence them. And it's the same issue we also sometimes see with newsrooms, that there's a tendency, to take women off the more difficult beats, and this amplifies the issue. And so two of the recommendations I'm mentioning, which is human rights due diligence assessments and increasing transparency of platforms and how they deal with this content. I'm mentioning this to go briefly into a proposal of how we can maybe begin to think about addressing this. UNESCO recently published guidelines for the governance of digital platforms. I assume quite a few of you have maybe also been involved in this process. It was a consultative process that we did over a year on these guidelines, where we really involved different stakeholders from platforms, civil society, media, governments, regulators. We received 10,000 comments, and that's kind of been brought into these guidelines. On the screen now, you see the 5 key principles that we are putting forward. So the conduction of human rights due diligence and risk assessments, the adherence to international human rights standards, again, also the increasing transparency of how tools are developed, making data available for research purposes, etc. And then as the 5th point, the increasing accountability. Again, you need to look at these guidelines as a whole, but since this is just a kind of brief setting the scene, I want to look a bit more in depth at the principle on human rights due diligence, because it's specifically pertinent to what we're talking about today. That in risk and impact assessments, platforms look at the gender impact, look at the impact of their policies on groups that may be specifically at risk. And that includes women and girls, and that includes human rights defenders, women journalists, environmental defenders. And I'm also focusing on this because next year, we also did another research which very clearly showed how online violence, specifically also against women journalists, escalates during electoral processes. And next year, we will have 2.6 billion people eligible to vote. It's the super election year. So I think it's one of the years with the most number of people going to the polls. And that makes it critically important to think about this before we go into that year. And what we're also calling for is conducting these risk assessment ahead of these events, but also in response to emergencies and crises, whether that's with regards to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or also the conflict that we are seeing now between Gaza and Israel. I will stop here. I will put all of these 3 pieces of research into the chat in a minute, and I'll be happy to delve a bit deeper into this either now or in the Q&A.
Fabulous. I'm sure we will do a little both, but I just as a follow-up question, because it's such a, well, all of these statistics are really quite alarming, but we see the all these elections that are happening, and we know that women of influence are particularly targeted. Would you just kind of expand on that a little bit more about, how you're going to be addressing that, helping out our
Yeah, of
system?
course. So, I mean, one is that we are now going into the implementation of these guidelines, and they are going to be focusing on countries in the global south. So also working with regulators, creating a network of regulators that are also dealing with these issues, but also quite practically, for example, in Indonesia, we'll have elections in February. And what colleagues are doing there is setting up emergency mechanisms that bring together representatives from platforms, but also from media houses, journalists themselves, and also looking at areas in Indonesia that are considered as high risk in terms of the electoral process, where we can expect to see more attacks on journalists in general, specifically women journalists. And that kind of connects the offline-online nexus a bit. And then also developing guidelines for risk assessments that also look into the impact of elections, specifically on journalists and also women journalists.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think what we want to really draw the line here is between gender equality, and rights of women to express themselves freely in all of their diversity, and robust democracy. And that once you start chilling, as in the words of UNESCO, half of the population, then you're really not going to have a democracy that's going to really last, be resilient or robust, and that this is the project of gender equality is also the project of democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think now, with another sort of landscape as we move into the regions, we'd love to hear from Stephanie Mikkelson, who's with us. Antonia is sitting in Paris, Stephanie's sitting in Seattle. We're really all around the world today. And Stephanie is from UNFPA, where she is part of the technology, or is the lead of the technology solution teams for gender-based violence and technology facilitated gender-based violence. UNFPA, of course, is the United Nations Population Fund. So Stephanie, we're going to go over to you and let you share your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And I also have my colleague on here, Alexandra Robinson, who definitely we do this work together as well as with the rest of our GBV team. But yes, thank you so much for the introduction, Kaylin. So just to give you a bit of an idea of today, I'm going to talk about the guidance on safe and ethical use of technology to address specifically gender-based violence programming and harmful practices. And before I do that, I kind of wanted to give just literally 1 minute to kind of position this piece of work into our overall programming work. GBV, gender-based violence, does fall under our broader mandate. So we do have a gender-based violence operational plan. And just to briefly say that we've integrated tech-facilitated gender-based violence, or tfGBV, into all of the different components. We have 4 major pillars. That's response, prevention, enabling environments, and data and research. For response, we are currently integrating tfGBV into existing GBV programming to make sure that it's sustainable and looking at the future in a very integrated approach. We're also developing a specific training package for frontline service providers so that they, as GBV providers, are able to integrate tfGBV into their current work. We're also developing a global tfGBV service hub for service providers as well as survivors. When we look at prevention, that's where this piece of work, this this guidance on how to create technology really fits in. So not only us as an organization to make sure our technology is safe, but also to make sure that other programming at the intersection of GBV isn't actually creating more tfGBV or more harm, whether it be online or offline. We also are working to integrate this work into existing comprehensive and sexual education programming for youth. When we look at enabling environments, we are looking at tech industry standards, so making sure that that our principles within GBV and other aspects are actually integrated into existing tech industry standards. And then, of course, we're working on a legal framework guidance with our partners here, hi Paloma, with Derechos Digitales. So I think she'll speak a bit more to that, but we're really excited about that work as well. And then on data and research, you know, we have our Making All Spaces Safe work, which is a scoping piece on tfGBV. And then we've also written some work on how to measure tfGBV in a safe and ethical way. And also there's a framework coming out on how to measure it from the programming level. Okay, so going forward, I think we can be ready to dive into the guidance a bit more. I will put this link in the chat, or let's see, I'll put the link in the chat right now. Sorry, click. And we can dive in. So just to give you an overview, the link that I sent you is a summary document, but the full guidance includes the definitions, principles. It has an overview of current technology broadly, as well as potential benefits and as well as risks. We have 17 steps of how to create this safe and ethical technology, and then promising practices, and then some annexes that are meant to be broken out. You see in the purple here, those are the aspects that are included in the summary that I shared the link with. So as we dive in, I think one of the most important aspects are really the principles. So in this guidance, we've combined gender-based violence, ethical practices. We've looked at data protection elements. We've looked at digital health, and we've pulled them together to really make sure that we have a full picture at this intersection. When we look at gender-based violence perspective, you know, common principles in that space are really do no harm. So making sure that you look at the risks and the benefits and weigh that out and know when we need to step aside, when it's actually not in the best interest to move forward on a project, if those harms outweigh the risk, if the risks outweigh the benefits. Really, of course, everything is survivor-centered, which bottom line, that means please do not assume what a survivor needs. A lot of times we assume that legislation is the best option, but that we know is not the case in a lot of settings. Survivors cannot sometimes leave their home and it's not in their best interest. So we need to make sure that we provide options for survivors so that they then are able to make those decisions on their own. Informed consent and transparency are really huge central aspects for gender-based violence, which can sometimes be difficult at the intersection of technology, but it's something that we push forward for. Participatory. Let's make sure that we're including those who we're designing for and understanding that there are different intersections and marginalized communities. Make sure that it's not just a focus group one-off, but that we're integrating them from ideation all the way into monitoring and lifetime of the project. Always let's make sure it's rights-based as well as advancing gender equality. So when we look at kind of the data protection, privacy specific angles, we're highlighting safety by design. So of course we have privacy by design, we have security by design. There's a newer terminology that's really trying to center around safety. So putting safety first and not as an afterthought. And I think that goes for anything that we create, and making sure that we're thinking about it from the beginning. Purpose limitation. So let's make sure we have an idea of what we're going to be building before we do it, and that we limit the purpose. Data minimization, I think, is a really important one at the intersection of GBV. Let's not get sucked into our typical way of creating technology, which is more data the better, because any extra data at the intersection of gender-based violence can be a risk. So we need to really acknowledge that one, and please only collect the data that we absolutely need. Proper use of data ethically. Let's make sure that we're using all of that. It goes hand in hand with the data minimization. Fairness, I think we all would agree with that, but yeah, it's nice to list out anyway. We've repeated informed consent, transparency, and ownership. We want to recognize and highlight that we want the user, in this case, typically the survivor, to be the one who has a bit more ownership of data, and recognize them as the owner of the data and not tech companies, organizations, and so forth. Of course, accuracy, data quality, security, accountability, and unconditional service. So I'm going to just quickly skip through a few slides because I think, yeah, we don't have a lot of time here. And like I said, I mentioned that the link is in the chat. But just to say that the guidance includes, here we have a framework to make sure that we're not just looking at the impact of the technology on an individual, but we're also looking at it on groups of people, be it religious, be it organizations, and then the societal impact, which I think is really important when we look at AI. As was mentioned, you can have generational silencing effects if things are not done in a safe and ethical way. This is to show that we need to be careful when we're doing threat mapping, actor mapping for security. We need to make sure that we also look at misogynistic individuals, groups, governments that are politically motivated to target women, women and girls and marginalized groups. So yeah, going beyond only the opportunist and financially motivated hackers. Whether harm is done intentional or malicious, it will have the same effect. So we need to recognize that and hold on to that responsibility as developers, that we need to be careful with people's data and making sure that we're not putting people in harm's way. We need to recognize that we need all three of safety, security, and privacy. Of course, there will be decisions that need to be made that will strengthen one or the other, but we see this as a three-legged stool, and we need to have all three in order for it to stand. So here are the 17 steps. I will not go through them, but just to say that we have tried to map out specifically what it looks like to build this technology. We've also mapped out when to bring GBV experts into the room, and when we think that that technology and security actors can work on their own. So yeah, please feel free to look at that in more detail in the guidance. Some annexes. And I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Very much, Stephanie. That's very super comprehensive and voluminous. I'd be interested to know when, at what point in the process you think that experts, gender-based violence experts and feminists should be brought into the room, and what part they have to play in the creation of this tech, and who this is meant for. Who do you want the audience to be reading this these guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, originally we wrote this for our own teams because we realized as we started diving into the topic of tfGBV, we were like, oh, okay, yes, we are collecting a lot of information as GBV actors. We're moving into this digital age, and we need to make sure that we're holding up our end of the deal with ethics and responsible practice, even within the digital age. So originally it was meant for our teams, but we've then realized quickly that there is nothing at this intersection, or there was very little a couple of years ago. I mean, this is growing quickly, but there's still nothing that we've seen that can really pull all of these worlds together. So that's where we say yes. And it's welcome for anybody at the intersection of GBV technology. You know, I presented this at the tech standards body, so they're even finding it useful, even though this was not our original intended audience. As far as bringing GBV actors into the room, I think having GBV actors really looking at the GBV risk and benefits. I think looking at the needs, the purpose, the outcome, the research. So rather than, a one-off, user case study, I think making sure that our research is a bit more robust than it might otherwise be, knowing that we are working with some of the most sensitive information and data, in the world, that this is very real for a lot of people, and it means offline harms, and in some cases, murder, femicide, feminicide. So yeah, we need to take this very seriously, and that's where GBV experts can really help with those user integration and building out those profiles as we go throughout. But then again, we've mapped it out so that they can be included throughout, whether they take primary or secondary role. I think making sure in testing, obviously, they're there, rollout, monitoring of the technology. Is also something really important as well, because it might be created and might be safe in the beginning, but that doesn't mean that if we don't have a chat feature that it might not be harmful down the road for the users or for those yeah, around the technology as well.
Yeah, exactly. To go back to our colleague from UNESCO talking about human rights due diligence, I think there's human rights impact, right? So there's ex ante and also post, what happens in the wild with all of these things, even with the best intentions and the best build. Well, you've teed this up sort of perfectly for us to go to our colleagues in India, because going from the very high level with these two really excellent landscapes to the very practical build, the lived experience of people who are working with colleagues every day who are now survivors of this gender-based violence. And for those of you who are new to this space, also it's only actually relatively recently that everybody has embraced, or member states and legislators have embraced, this idea that the harms in the digital world can be just as profound and scarring as the harms from the analog world, that in real life. And this combination of in real life and the digital is something that Shohini Banerjee at Point of View deals with every day. She's a knowledge specialist with Point of View, which is an organization based in Mumbai, which is working to create a gender equal world online. And she spent the last decade working with various organizations on GBV prevention and response programs. So she's going to take over the screen and talk about the recent work with the FAIR Network, which we're very proud of, on reimagining automated violence interventions through participatory technology design, which is exactly what has been suggested to us just now by our colleagues in the global north. So over to you, Shohini.
Thanks, Caitlin, and I hope that everyone can see my screen. So Point of View, we've been working in the intersection of sexuality, gender, and technology for quite some time now. And in the last year and a half, we've run this helpline called TechSakhi that provides information and support on issues of digital safety and security to women, girls, LGBTQ communities. And together with Digital Futures Lab and Design Beku, we wanted to kind of look at how can technology, especially automated violence interventions, play a role in service for survivors of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. So just giving a little bit of background, and then I will go into our research process and some of the findings that we had. India has the fastest growing users of technology devices, but there is a big gender gap. Women are 40% less likely to own a mobile phone and 33% less likely to use the internet. Experiences online are also gendered from concepts of, and I think this has already been alluded in the previous two presentations, but the technology facilitated gender-based violence for women and girls is a lived reality, but also access to phones
vary widely. So the experience is quite gendered. There's a perception. So in some spaces, there's a perception that phones or access to the internet is going to play a corruptive role. Therefore, women and girls often have less sophisticated phones or have shared usage. There might be limited usage of phones. So knowledge around, say, access to financial apps and how to navigate digital finance in the digital space might be less. So in the context of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, so this includes anything from, say, sexual harassment online to doxing or sharing of people's personal information. And I think Stephanie was alluding to the need of having a survivor-centric approach when we are looking at what type of support is needed. And the violence doesn't just stay online. So doxing is a clear example of this, where someone's identity, information, phone number is shared, and that can have physical repercussions offline. The impact is high on, and as Caitlin has rightly said, there's increased awareness of its impact on physical safety, mental health, economic, and general digital participation for survivors. We found, both through the research in India, but also through the digital literacy and security workshops that we've been running with our partners, that there are multiple problems. One is the perception of and the reality that the online space is not that safe. When people face this type of problems, there's often a protectionist attitude, like taking away access to phone, or victim blaming and saying, for example, why did you share photos online? And there's also self-censorship. So the experience of other women and girls can lead to to many people, as research again has shown, and our anecdotal evidence, that there's self-censorship in terms of what type of content gets shared, what type of platforms people are on. And there are many mechanisms that of trying to address technology-facilitated gender-based violence, including CSO initiatives. There are some legislation that tries to address it, while not directly. It falls under scope of privacy, fraud, and other such parallel or tangential cybercrime issues. And there's also been an exploration globally of how can technology, especially AI, be used as a solution. But for us, it was really important to, again, I think the previous panelists really kind of spoke about this, the importance of creating a safe and ethical technology. So the technology that we are thinking about, the solutions that we're thinking about, to make sure that it does not replicate the patterns that are contributing to gender-based violence, one of which is full participation. So being kind of survivor-centric and having survivor voices part of the design of a solution, as well as ensuring that there's sufficient knowledge and information. So knowledge, I mean, AI is a hot topic. Everyone is speaking about it, but what does it really mean? And how can that knowledge gap be bridged to come up with participatory-led solutions? So some of the questions that we tried to answer, and we, throughout our research, when we started talking to experts, we decided to just focus on a particular solution or service to address technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which is Tech Sakhi, the helpline that Point of View runs. And so the questions that we were trying to ask are, what are some of the pain points or bottlenecks that arise when speaking to survivors? So what type of issues do survivors face, and what type of issues do responders face? Because it's running a helpline is
quite resource and care intensive, and therefore to facilitate that process, to ensure that both the response is more effective, but also there's an element of care in the response. How can we look at the user journey and identify the pain points to use automated solutions to alleviate that? So the second question is, what are some of the AI interventions that support but do not override the human touch points in the process of providing support, which we found to be essential, that the human touch point is required. And then lastly, how do techie responders feel about their incorporation of AI, and how can it be introduced to make their work and the support that they give to survivors more effective? So I'll skip the methodology a little bit and just kind of go into some of what we ended up doing, which was to assess the user and map the user journey. And we kind of identified it as 4 separate broad phases. And here you can see the specific steps that a caller takes. So the 4 phases are pre-call. So when the survivor requires help and needs to seek out some sort of support. The second is the assessment piece, where the caller and responder are connected, and the caller is and the responder kind of together identifies the problem. And the reason why I kind of articulated that in that way is oftentimes the language used might be different. So for example, if someone says that I've been hacked, the responder, who is an expert in that situation, can help navigate the problem, and perhaps the identification of the issue is not that the caller had been hacked, but that they were unable to log into their account for various reasons. And the target audience for our helpline is primarily the first statistics that I shared, is where there's an increased number of users in the digital space in India. So these are new digital users, often shared phone digital users with limited to budding knowledge of accessing the digital space. So assessment, the third is providing the information and solution. And oftentimes this is co-discussed, or rather our principle is that we provide information and we can provide help survivors think through the risks and benefits and pros and cons of various solutions, but we are not capable of knowing their entire life and what is most needed for them. So we are guides in that way. And then the end is once the call is done, and this is the part of the user journey where we are not often privy to whether that solution has been effective or not. And what we found, what we had initially thought would be helpful, is the assessment period takes quite some time, and therefore perhaps the automation could be done there, and then connect to a human responder. But we found that it was really important at the assessment stage that there was a human touch point, and then there's bifurcation of different types of cases, and some cases could have an element of automation, but some cases could not. And so we went into assessing these different types of calls and came up with a few potential solutions that might be helpful. The first is, at the assessment stage, because we are a telephone-based helpline, we are often unable to see what's in front of the survivor's phone. So we thought of using an AI image reading software that could that the caller could screenshot and send to us. But as is one of the basic principles for survivors, and also in the use of the creation of ethical technology, is that we didn't want confidentiality breached. So in a screenshot, there might be a lot of information, sensitive data that would not be required. So how can that this AI image reading software also obscure those sensitive information? The second was kind of to look at whether we could have some AI facilitated triage, prioritizing calls that depending on urgency. So our helpline we receive about 100 calls a day. So they vary in terms of urgency. Some are about access to login details and their accounts, whereas there are more pressing and urgent situations like those of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. The third potential solution that we were looking at is, again, looking at who our audience is. We have a lot of people from low resource settings calling us, and so or sometimes there are callers who may not have privacy in their home, but there is a lot of background noise, and that kind of forms barriers to getting information, but also to creating a safe space for that brief period when the survivor is talking to a responder. So again, thinking about using noise canceling AI technologies to distinguish between human and background noises. And lastly, we were thinking of not just how these types of solutions would be helpful for survivors to reduce the amount of time that they have to explain their issue, and to make their call more effective, but also how can responders be able to get their information and support a survivor in the most effective way. So the fourth solution that we were looking at is AI-powered search to elevate the current search functionality. And these are all certain, so our process of mapping the user journey, speaking to the responders, looking at the calls and kind of triangulating this information. These are the first set of potential automated interventions that might be helpful. And the idea is that we would continue working with the responders and then eventually work with survivors to find the effectiveness of these potential solutions and take it forward. So with that, I will.
That's perfect. Thanks, Shohini. So you were, you sort of, the last, I just want to go back for a moment to your methodology, because you're really rooted in the community. You've really been doing this for quite a long time as Texaki and point of view. And could you just briefly go, let's just touch back to what the survivors were saying and what your conversations were with them about this process and how to make this process more elegant and useful.
Sure. So Padmini, I don't know if you want to take up the research methodology, this bit a little bit.
Yeah. So yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for having us. So I think what we were anxious about was that, I mean, obviously, as Shohini was saying, and as the previous speakers have said, that privacy is absolutely key to this process when we have callers. And obviously, the calls are anonymous, so there is actually no way to track back to the callers. And that is the way that it should be, right? Because as I think one of the previous speakers said, the more data you have, the more danger there is of identifiability. And so, the kind of data pipeline is quite slim in terms of how much data it's collecting from the callers. So we did realize that actually participatory methods, as the way that we tend to conceive it, wasn't really applicable or could not actually be used kind of fruitfully in this case, which is why we thought about focusing on the responders. And so when we're talking about participatory research or participatory design methods, the participants were the responders, because they obviously have kind of the lived experience, both of course, supporting the survivors. But also, I think it's worth bearing in mind that responders who are doing this kind of work are incredibly prone and vulnerable to burnout. There is a lot of susceptibility to being traumatized by the content that they're having to constantly deal with. Because of the nature of the anonymity of the caller, there's often a scenario where responders don't actually know whether the person has been able to resolve their problem and get closure, which is also very anxiety provoking. So here, I think when we are kind of talking about the survivors, we're kind of actually, in a sense, talking about kind of second level survivors, who are the people who are taking these calls kind of, every day. It's a very small team. So it's quite a lot of kind of effort for them. So what we were just trying to understand is what do they find are the bottlenecks when they are taking these calls. And of course, it's a fairly relatively new service as well. So there are certain things that have been changed and streamlined. But these were a few of the kind of recommendations that we could think of based on how they told us they were, struggling with certain aspects of dealing with this work every day.
Okay, thank you, Padmini. I think that we're going to be returning to that, but I think we're going to continue our journey ping-ponging around the world now, and go to from also very much on the ground, from our colleague in MENA, Raya Sharbain from Tor Project, who's a trainer in digital security and research, who focuses on digital surveillance and censorship. So, and she works on privacy preserving technology. So Raya, do you want to take over the floor here and just talk to us a little bit about what's happening in this relationship with gender-based violence? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, and hello, everyone. All right, my intervention is going to be a bit different. I'll focus a lot on Palestine, tackling specifically the issue of surveillance and AI. So Palestine in theory is a feminist issue, and in practice, it's a territory suffering from settler colonialism, occupation, and militarism. In 2021, Amnesty International published an extensive report titled Automated Apartheid, looking into the Israeli occupation's use of facial recognition and AI-based surveillance technologies to subject millions of Palestinians to restrictions on their movement on their own land. So the hundreds of checkpoints that the occupation placed around Palestine, the 700-kilometer separation wall, are all equipped with a set of facial recognition technologies, and Palestinians' faces are being swiped on the daily without consent and added to a large database to automatically and inaccurately identify them, contain them in specific zones, arbitrarily detain them, and also kill them. It's a system and a database that the occupation has named Red Wolf. So after 2021, this is also from the report that Amnesty published, this technology was ported into mobile phones. So the occupation forces carry an application on their phones called Blue Wolf to record the faces of Palestinians on the go and register their biometric identities in swaths as they're roaming around their cities. So AI in this case is a coercive tool. It's designed to subjugate Palestinians and maintain the Israeli occupation's domination in the land of Palestine. What the past 2 months have also shown us is an exacerbation of the Israeli occupation's AI-powered surveillance. So it's one thing to subject a besieged and occupied population in Gaza to an AI-powered surveillance reality, the one we just talked about previously, with unmanned drones flying overhead every day, conducting passive reconnaissance for the obvious purpose of exerting control and supposedly, allegedly, to also identify and discern between military and civilian targets. It's another thing to forego this enormous amount of data collected without consent, and which is used to feed a military AI system, surveillance system, and choose to bomb indiscriminately. In the words of an Israeli intelligence officer, they have turned Gaza into a mass assassination factory. So Habsora, which translates to the gospel, is the AI military machine that I was talking about, which processes this enormous amount of data and allegedly recommends bombing sites in real time. Allegedly, it's supposed to target militants only, leaving little collateral damage, but the killing has been based on wide targets without focus on accuracy in order to save time. This reminds me when the drone leaker Daniel Hale revealed how unmanned automated American drones flying overhead in Afghanistan would shoot at targets based on broad and inaccurate cellular data with total impunity. So an occupying power will often count civilian deaths by subtracting any male over age of 18. It's an accounting trick to lower civilian death counts, and it actually dehumanizes both men and women. As a result, today, several hundreds of Palestinian families have been wiped off of civil registries. Despite this evidence and these damning testimonies from the occupation itself, we are still debating whether this amounts to a genocide. I would even argue that for the first time in history, this is an AI-powered genocide. Today, in an underestimation, we count nearly 18,000 killed Gazans, half of which are children, a quarter women. When the automated translator of Instagram translates Palestinian to terrorist, it's not just an error, but it reverberates materially. Violence doesn't stay online, as our colleagues said previously. When the one on Facebook translated a Palestinian's post of good morning to attack them, it's beyond exacerbating. So our bodies are not disposable. That's what I want to get to, and that's what feminism teaches us. Resisting colonial violence and oppression is a duty and a feminist act. State-sanctioned technology, under the guise of promoting safety and security, is a known trap. And a feminist AI is one that values life, human life, rather than discards it and discriminates against it. A feminist AI is one that is centered around justice. So to throw in some examples, based on this project, which is the FAIR project, the Feminist AI research project, I envision an AI that supports, in the context of Palestine, journalistic investigations into war crimes, an AI that supports with reproducing satellite imagery towards that goal, to support with humanitarian efforts and relief. Machines, we have to remember, don't build themselves. They do not exist in a vacuum. We are accountable to how we construct them and how they end up demonstrating their use and abuse. I'll stop there, and I thank everyone for listening.
Thank you, Raya. I just also, in the interest of getting to the panel, I'm just going to ask you if you're able to briefly share with us some of the digital defense techniques that you're teaching your colleagues.
So yes, a lot of my work focuses on training people to defend against surveillance. So it's a lot also on working on the preventative side. So the things they could do, how they could use their phones, their laptops, and even just how to communicate and browse online safely and securely. A lot of the things I do promote is open source technology, one that is funded with and supported by a lot of nonprofit organizations. And mainly that.
Well, on this very, very moving landscape that you've gave us, and very, we're going to now look sort of at the state focus on cybercrimes and the Cybercrime Convention with our colleague Paloma Lara Castro, who's sitting in Latin America and the Caribbean, sitting in Uruguay today. And she's the public policy coordinator at Derechos Digitales. So Paloma, we'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Foremost, I wanted to express my full solidarity to the Palestinian people for these atrocious crimes that are going on at the moment. So that's just firsthand. And just to begin, I need to share my screen, so bear with me for a second. Okay, as Caitlin mentioned, I worked at Derechos Digitales, which is a Latin American NGO that has more than 18 years of experience working in the intersection of technology and human rights. We've also done a lot of work regarding the gender perspective in these interactions. So we've done a lot of work, as I said, on these issues, but I'm going to focus this presentation specifically on a research we've done that, as you can see on the screen, is called When Protection Becomes an Excuse for Criminalization, which focuses on the gender effects of criminalization. Just to give a bit of context, as Caitlin mentioned, this research is done in the context of the cybercrime treaty that is being discussed right now at the UN. It's been going on for 2 years, and now actually in January is the concluding session of the treaty, of the negotiations. From the beginning of this announcement of the ad hoc committee to deal with this cybercrime treaty, we've been active participants in expressing our concerns on how this treaty lacks sufficient safeguards regarding human rights, and also legitimizes surveillance in broad and international cooperation capabilities, which is very concerning. And also how the lack of a gender perspective within the treaty as a whole and throughout the whole articles may generate criminalizing effects which can deepen gender inequalities. So taking this into account, what we wanted to do was to provide research that can provide evidence-based facts on how existing gender crimes legislations around the world have been used and are being used to criminalize dissent and have a specific consequences on gender equality, as we consider that freedom of expression is a basic and essential right to guarantee gender equality. So as I mentioned, and we all know here, and has been mentioned by colleagues, internet has a double space, right? So at the same time as it has become a social political tool of great relevance, there's still a lot of endangerment within the digital space for women specifically and LGBTQ communities. And this can be seen very clearly in several aspects, but I'm going to focus on just 2 of them that are addressed in the research that has to do with tfGBV, that, as colleagues have mentioned, is an increasing problem that's been translated to offline spaces and onto online spaces as a continuum, as we all know. And then on the second hand is the use of legislation or the use of the criminal system to weaponize women's rights and to criminalize dissent, creating a chilling effect, as has been mentioned before. So as we all know, even though that states do have the effective obligation to combat and address all types of violence against women and against minorities, we have identified that this obligation has been translated mostly into the criminal arena, with the generation of legislation that, although they aim to protect these vulnerable groups as women and LGBT communities, as I have mentioned, they usually tend to generate the opposite effect. So as they're often not only ineffective and disproportional, but they also put people at risk. So this evidently has differentiated impacts, as already the colleagues have mentioned, specifically regarding human rights defenders and journalists who are being specifically targeted for their opinions or for having or for occupying a space of powers given in politics, or for example in journalism, or just for having a voice, just for not only for the content they're expressing, but just because of the gender of the person who is expressing their opinion. And this also has a chilling effect, not only personally, but also in levels of society. And in this point, it's important to puntualize or to refer to that the use of the online space as a way to promote freedom of expression has been key in a lot of communities to recognize rights and also to generate public policies to combat online violence or GBV. This also generates more violence when we consider intersecting characteristics of people who are being targeted in this type of violence. So as going back again to the criminal aspect of the situation, as I mentioned, the obligations of states have been predominantly focused on the criminal arena, and these legislations are not being effective to protect human rights of women and minorities in these spaces. And this is not a new problematic. I mean, this is something that has been recognized by international international organizations, as well as international bodies that have identified that cybercrime legislation has been used as a growing trend around the world, used to criminalize dissent. So the way we mapped out this investigation, as I referred to before, we wanted to give evidence-based facts. And this was to show that we're not talking about potential risks of this type of legislation, but actually concrete harms. So we have identified 11 cases from around the world. I'm going to put the link later on after I finish my presentation so you can access to the whole investigation. But basically, we have identified laws in Cuba, Egypt, Jordan, Libya, Nicaragua, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, and Uganda, and Venezuela that showcase how these legislations are being used against women and minorities. So we have all of the people that are involved in these cases or that have been prosecuted for this in these cases are all women and or members of the LGBTQ community. All of these cases also show that the laws, even though in some cases are different, in some cases we're talking about specific cybercrime legislations, in some cases so we're talking about legislation created specifically to respond to tfGBV, and in some cases we're talking about just criminal legislation applied to online spaces. So even though there are many laws involved in this process of research, there is a trend or several trends that we will be looking at profoundly in the next slides, but that tend to generate laws without impact human rights assessment, without a gender perspective in the generation, design, and much less implementation of the law. And they do not meet the human rights criteria of necessity, legality, and proportionality. And they do not establish a concrete and well-founded link between the act committed and the harm caused, which ultimately leads to criminalization, uncertainty in the law, and processes that harm socially as well as individually. So these are the basic trends that we have identified. The truth used as a persecution tool. So the truth without being properly defined, for example, in laws regarding disinformation or fake news, so that the truth is only left up to arbitrary, sorry, the English and this switch in Spanish, arbitrary interpretation of the law, and usually used to stifle dissent. Then the morality as a basis for criminalization, this is specifically seen in cases regarding tfGBV, where the uses involve the laws invoked to protect usually end up using clauses of morality that actually end up only policing the way women interact online and tend to have a more of a disciplinary objective rather than a protectionary one. And the last one that regards specifically to laws generated for combating tfGBV is the way that these laws are used to create censorship, surveillance, and ultimately criminalize women and minorities. Also, these legislations, specifically the ones related to these all three trends that I mentioned, that I mean, I have to say that obviously these are not the only ones that are being used around the world, but these are the ones that we identified that came up more repeatedly in the legislations we analyzed. So the truth used as a persecution tool, as I said, often involves laws that are not properly defined and that don't take into account something that we consider very basic and centric for protecting human rights, that has to do with the balance of rights. So, for example, we have many cases on this, but I would like to just point out a few of them just to map out how this is actually being used for. So, for example, these laws include independent media journalists being persecuted for publishing a story where she informed the population on the role of the state in protests, for example. Then there's another activist that was calling out for a protest using her social media, and she was arrested like after 3 or 4 minutes after posting online. Then there involves also an activist, an anti-war activist who used her social media to pronounce herself against the Ukrainian invasion, and then was later on incarcerated for propagating false news or false information. And one case that specifically just really visualizes the way this can be escalated and how serious these type of legislations can get in terms of impact and punishment, which is a case of a woman, a student who actually was not even an activist. She wasn't even carrying out an activist trajectory, but rather just she was retweeting and reposting other activist content. And she was sentenced to 34 years of prison just because of having a Twitter account and because of retweeting the false news information according to the government. So these are all types of cases that really showcase how legislations that are broad and vague will be and can be used to weaponize dissent. Another trend, as I mentioned, is the morality as the basis for criminalization. And this, as I already mentioned, is not new. That is why already the UN Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression has already identified that several laws around the world use morality clauses as a way to control content that they analyze to be inappropriate, obscene, or indecent, that actually has been used more to more work as police women's bodies and sexual expression rather to protect them. And this is an example that we found, for example, where a blogger and content creator was arrested because of doing an art presentation in which the government considered was violating public honor and morals, as well as using the Cybercrime Act. And it's important to know that up to this point, there's no information regarding what was the content and why was it considered unmoral. It's like kind of like a card used that doesn't need any explanation, or that's how it's being used. And then the third, that has to do specifically with tfGBV, involves legislations that were created under the aim or the intent of protecting women from tfGBV, but was actually used to weaponize people who actually, in one case, invoke the legislation for protection, and in another case, just used by the president to determine what was cyber stalking and what was not. So in the first case, it's important to note that it was a gay man who was a victim of sextortion. So he went up to the police to file a complaint, and actually the complaint was not even filed, but he ended up being prosecuted for soliciting online prostitution. And also, and the other case was a human rights defender, a very well-known human rights defender who constantly used her social media to express political dissent, and actually was following very specific fights for women and feminism. So she was very well known and targeted before this type of legislation, but actually the tfGBV, the legislation was used against her as a cyber stalking, and she was sentenced to 16 months of imprisonment. She is now exiled. So as we can see, if these laws are created within existing gender inequalities, and without taking in proper account of balance of rights and an actual gender lens in creating, designing, and implementing the legislation, they only end up being not only ineffective, but also perpetuating and profundizing gender inequalities that are pre-existing of the law. So, and that is not something that is new. I mean, there's lots of research pointing at how if the law reflects a society, but doesn't take into account new stages of research and new stages of evidence and talking to the victims and engaging in participatory processes, they end up only just reproducing and endangering even more within the legislation. So that was one of our main concerns we had within this cybercrime legislation treaty, and we still have them because there's a very dangerous aspect on advancing on human right on international criteria on cybercrime that can end up, in the one hand, influencing directly on national legislation that, for example, is still working towards legal provisions to address this type of issues, and also to legitimize existing ones, such as the ones that we have identified in this research. But also, as we know, having an international body legitimizing this type of treaty is evidently more concernful and evidently more it creates a greater possibility to generate more problems and also to be more difficult for civil society to defend upon these issues, because there's a treaty that actually says, yeah, it's okay, this is legitimized. So basically what we're saying in this regard is that we need to operate this type of legislations from a impact assessment, human rights assessment, and gender assessment impacts that actually take into account the gender mainstreaming within the designing, creation, legislation, monitoring, and implementing of this type of legislations, not only in international treaties, but also in national legislation. As I said, the gender blind legislation is just potentially to exacerbate the problem of the law, furthering the articulation of gender inequalities. And so for the integration of the gender perspective to actually be effective, it has to be intersectional, as has been mentioned before. It has to be dual, it has to be multiple, and it has to be parting from a survivor-centric approach. Taking these matters into account, as we continue to work towards the international treaty, which, as I mentioned, is going to be having its final session on January, which we are seeing that there's not really an advancement of considering human rights in this regard. Actually, propositions have been going backwards. While we've been gaining some battles, we have been going back like 5 steps every time. So this is a very worrisome scenario that needs to be taken into account when we analyze this. And then also, and then I'm going to close up here. When we think about this type of legislations, we're obviously have to take into account 2 equally important aspects. On the one hand, the increasing of this type of violence and its impacts, but on the same hand, how do we approach them in a legislative matter that actually takes into account these problems as a way to protect women and minorities, and not as a way to keep perpetuating this gender inequality. So thinking about this type of framework and how should it look like and what should it not look like, we're working on a research with UNFPA, as Stephanie mentioned, creating guidelines of how tfGBV needs to be considered from a human rights and gender sensitive and human survivor-centric perspective to legislate on these matters that takes into account the balance of rights as a basic and essential point of departure, and also the experiences of the people who are actually going through this violence, as to whether to know, as people have mentioned before me, what are the actual needs and how can the legislation help advance towards those needs, rather than to work as an actual perpetrator. How can we guarantee that the law doesn't become another perpetrator? So I'm going to leave it at that.
That's fabulous. Thank you so, so much, Paloma. Actually, in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine a question I want to ask you from your excellent presentation and a question that's in the chat from a colleague from Nigeria, so we can make sure that we have all continents at least represented here, because I think the two of them sort of work together. So I'm going to throw this out to the panel, knowing that we have about 10 minutes left. So everybody be judicious in your time, please. What would what would a survivor-centric approach look like from your particular point of view, right? Which you've just really very eloquently laid out, Paloma, in this particular convention. But how does that look from the local point of view, from regional, national points of view, or also from our colleague, Emmy Akpan, I hope I say your name correctly, I think, Nigeria, who said the existing laws in our Q&A says the existing laws are not very responsive, but there's a huge issue of it not being recognized as violence, and there's less alarm about it. What does this conversation start for me in my local context? Because as we know, there's a spectrum of ways that everybody's dealing with it in different regions. So to address one or the other, or kind of both, and let's start back from, I'm going to get over to Antonia.
Sorry, and it's been super insightful also to listen to the colleagues. So thank you very much for your presentations. I mean, I think for me, I will talk more about the survivor-centric aspect rather than the local level, because I think the colleagues are better placed to address that from their perspectives. But when you delve more, for example, into the guidelines, you will see that they are really addressed as a multi-stakeholder approach at the different players at the table, and they are meant to also give a tool to advocate for an internet that's based on human rights and that's inclusive and participatory. And particularly one way of doing that is, I think it's something we spoke about yesterday as well, is that when we are going into the implementation of these guidelines, the risk assessment frameworks that look specifically at the dangers that policies can have for groups that are at risk, or also those that have already been subjected to online violence. I don't want to expand too much because the guidelines are quite a comprehensive document, but yeah, I'm also happy if you want to pass on my contact details or those of other colleagues of mine to answer any follow-up questions.
Absolutely. We're going to have the presentations, and we'll also have all the links. We'll be bundling it together for everyone. But Stephanie, could you want to talk about a survivor-centric approach, what that means? But also, how do somebody who's in a jurisdiction that's not looking at this violence, even maybe in the analog world, as being real, legitimate violence? How do you deal with that spectrum from analog to digital? How would you address this for our colleague in Nigeria? Stephanie, yeah.
Yes, sorry. I mean, I think one aspect, to really make it very real for us, since we're all, I think, practitioners or work with practitioners, when we talk about survivor-centered approach, I think, in addition to kind of what I was saying earlier, that we need to recognize that we don't understand what the survivor is going through, and that every survivor is going to have a unique experience that will require a unique response. I think also when we talk about the practicalities, like, one thing I think that people often think that they need to do is go and find an actual survivor and talk to them and put them in front of this. But I think, what we know from like gender-based violence data collection and ethics is that we need to, be very careful about putting those people at risk. So what we suggest is not to call up your local, hotline, or, to find a focus group of survivors, of known survivors, but instead, make sure that you're talking, as our colleagues have mentioned, to advocates of gender-based violence, those who are working working with survivors can speak on their behalf, understand the issues, the ins and outs, or just know that 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of GBV. So bringing it up as a general topic, knowing that likely if you pull together women in a room, they will have experienced this. So yeah, just to speak, I wanted to mention that because I think that that's a very strong and usual misconception about a survivor-centered approach. Yeah, so I'll actually pause there because that was a bit of taking the mic.
So, Padmini, so for either both survivor-centric, you've dealt with a bit of this when you talk about your methodology, but also when one is living in a place where maybe it's acceptable to have physical violence, no less digital technology facilitated violence. What are the entry points, and what does our colleague do in Nigeria?
Sure. So yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Stephanie, for saying that. I think we agree. Basically, I think for us, survivor-centric work is key. The key thing that we look at is not re-traumatizing the survivor. And I think as we work more and more with AI, there's so much risk of that happening. And basically, that's why we feel that, you know, putting AI kind of somewhere else, kind of more kind of downstream rather than, or sorry, rather upstream rather than downstream towards the survivor is a way to ensure that they don't come to any harm, because we can't really with any conviction say that an AI will not make a mistake, right? And therefore re-traumatize. So I think, you know, we want to kind of keep AI away from survivors in a direct encounter. With regards to kind of local mores and contexts, I think, I mean, drawing on what Antonia was saying about like platforms and, you know, the kind of ideal optimized platform, that's fantastic, but it's so difficult for us to persuade people who run these platforms in any country, really. But in India, for example, we know that the major social networks are all in conversation with the government and are only going to allow for certain kinds of content to be marked as hate speech, to be marked as violence. And often, you know, kind of violence against women is not something that is responded to. You know, we all report as much as we can, and often we get, you know, responses saying, oh, that, you know, we didn't find this to be violating our community guidelines. And when those community guidelines are, I guess, shaped by the influence that a government has on the platform, it's very difficult to kind of break out of that kind of mode because their power is so great. So that's not very helpful for our colleague in Nigeria, but that's the reality, I'm afraid. Caitlin, you're on mute.
There you go. I'm so sorry. I don't see you, Raya, but I don't want to skip over you. But am I not? There you are. So survivor-centric, please.
It's a bit difficult to answer this question and to reflect on it. I mean, I echo what colleagues have been saying in terms of focusing as well on legal frameworks and trying to hold our own states accountable in terms of what kinds of legal frameworks can be put forward in this, in terms of cybercrime and so on. But yeah, it warrants some more reflection as well. So yeah.
And I know that we've also, but also I keep on reflecting. I don't have a great answer myself for what this spectrum of going from violence that's happening in the physical world that's just being replicated at great speed and at all 4 V's in the digital world is obviously also something. And that's why it's very interesting for me to look at the work, and I'll go to Paloma to sort of to wrap up, is this how we have to sort of beat back, not to use a sort of horrible verb there, a lot of the norms and the stereotypes that exist in our physical world that are just really being replicated at sort of speed in the digital world. And that's sort of the point that I'm getting to. So Paloma, do you have something to say on either of these 2 questions? either words of advice for our colleagues in Nigeria or about survivor-centric approaches? Because it came from your wonderful presentation, my question.
Thank you, Caitlin. Well, I mean, I agree and on all of the colleagues have already pointed out. I think they all pointed out to very important points, so I don't want to be repetitive, but only to just focus on that getting legislation right is not easy, but it needs to be rights-based. And that means having total and safeguards, like human rights safeguards in the first place, to have balance of rights. And that also includes that when we think about the legislation, not only think of aspects as, for example, the continuum of violence, but also the continuum of exercising rights in the online spaces. So we also need to protect freedom of expression, privacy, and also sexual and reproductive rights as a center and core part when we consider violence against women. So I think that that is essential in applying a gender mainstream perspective. So I think those are the kind of like the basic elements we need to take into account of, and also to just to be specific regarding that we need to apply human rights standards that are universal, but also need to take into account the specific context in order to avoid an all-fits solution, because we all know that different contexts require different needs and different practices regarding that. So I think there are all elements to take into account, and to also consider the intersectional aspects of the popularity. As Stephanie mentioned, not all victims and survivors are one homogeneous groups. They vary. So we do need to take into account historically marginalized groups that these continue to be more affected by violence, censorship, surveillance, and control. And all these elements have to be taken into account in order to legislate, implement, and monitor the legislation.
Fabulous. That was a fabulous wrap up. And also the right to live free from violence, right? Which particularly affects women and girls. This is like a human right that's been enshrined in all of these amazing other rights. It's been a nuanced, a sophisticated, a thoughtful, and I think rather impactful conversation all around the world. And I really just want to thank you all, from sitting in Paris, Antonia Eser-Ruperti at UNESCO, from sitting in Seattle, Stephanie Mikkelson, UNFPA, to our colleagues in India, in Mumbai, Shohini, Banerjee from Point of View, and Padmini from Design Beku, Paloma, Lara, Castro, and Derechos Digitales sitting in Uruguay. And our heart goes out to our sister Raya Sharbain sitting in Jordan and doing good work and caring so deeply. And we all support you, and we all look forward to continuing this conversation together and helping each other through and building the world that we deserve to live in and that we will build together. So thanks so much, everyone.